Greetings, folks. Healer here. Just a really quick preamble before I get to the main part of the video. This video ended up being quite a bit longer than I had originally planned. I have left an index in the video description below in case you want to skip to any particular sections. I thought there was a lot of important and useful information here, even if it is subject to change, and there will be lots of changes. So some of the things that I'm going to cover here will end up being, basically obsoleted with the changes that wargaming will eventually make. But hopefully the basis of what I've covered here is clear and useful for the long term. So with that, I bring you a presentation of the proposed commander skills for battleships under the new commander skill system. Greetings, folks. Healer here. So a couple of days ago, Wargaming announced on the World of Warships development blog their intentions to completely overhaul the commander skill system in the game. And I did a video a couple of days ago when the article was posted that went through the article at sort of a high level. It covers the general motivation, the structure, and basic principles of the change. But in this video and in some subsequent videos, I want to go through the actual skill trees and talk through some of the implications of some of the new and changed skills that would be coming per the current proposal. Now, I do need to stress that all of this is preliminary. There is going to be plenty of changes, and even the target release, which is 0911, could even change. However, my expectation and my experience in software development over the last 3 decades or so tells me that wargaming is probably pretty well firm on the general approach and the structure, even if the skills themselves undergo some changes and some refinement, certainly based on the feedback. But my thinking at this point is that when Wargaming posts something on the development blog, they're already 2/3 to 3/4 the way to being done, and they're mainly dealing with more tactical changes and less, overhaul structural changes. But we'll have to see how it goes, because this is a big change. And like we saw with some of the other changes like IFHE and AA and the carriers, things can, drag on a little bit depending upon how the community receives things and how things work out during testing. So I'm not going to try to spend too much time on this article or on this material, but I think it's worth going into some of it so that you guys understand the direction that Wargaming is thinking with the content. Okay, so enough background. Let me jump over to the spreadsheet that is linked in the article that I just showed you that has these skills by class and by level. So I'm going to go, like I said, I'm going to go through battleships today, and I'll talk through each of the skills. Some of them are just straight replacements for what we have today, so there won't need to be much in the way of explanation. Other skills are going to encompass capabilities of existing skills that we have and not in others. And then other skills will be dropped entirely. And I'll talk about what those are, and I'll also give some initial thoughts on what I think some of the build approaches might be based on the skill structure that they have currently defined. All right, so starting with the level 1 skills, the first one is called Loader. This is what we call Expert Loader today. It performs identically and is the same function. One recommendation I would make to Wargaming, if you're going to watch this video, please try to keep the names of the skills the same where the function is the same. It's already going to be a significant learning curve for the community to learn a whole new commander system, and if we're changing the names of things that they already understand well today, that's only going to amplify the learning curve or steepen the learning curve. So my recommendation would be to keep this skill, Expert Loader, and there's a number of other examples here, and you'll see them as we go along. The next skill is Pyrotechnist. This is, again, a level 1 skill, and it acts as a sort of quasi-demolition expert for battleships. It only increases the chance of fire from both main battery and secondary armaments by 1/2%, so it's a fairly modest improvement. I'm not sure how compelling of a skill this is, but we'll have to see. Next skill is Consumables Specialist, and this acts as the jack of all trades for a select set of consumables. So it will reduce the cooldown time or the reload time on consumables by 10%, specifically for the main battery reload booster, torpedo reload booster, although I don't know any battleships right now that have that consumable, spotting aircraft, fighter, and defensive AA fire consumable. So that one seems to be fairly obvious. And also, this is now a level 1 skill instead of Jack of all trades, which is level 2. The next skill is Emergency Repair Specialist, and this reduces the cooldown time on Damage Control Party and Repair Party by 5%. So this acts in some way as a slightly cheaper high alert combined with the Jack of all trades. In fact, actually, one point I should make out here is Jack of all trades reduces the cooldown on consumables by 5% across the board. This one actually improves it by 10%. So there's actually a buff here for a lower cost skill. So I could see consumables expert being useful, and certainly emergency repair specialist is useful. All right, the next skill is AA Gunner, and this increases the number of explosions in an AA salvo by 1. And what they mean by explosions is they're referring to the flak clouds, the long-range AA bubbles that ships have. This might be useful for an AA build, but otherwise, again, doesn't, at least on the surface to me, doesn't seem particularly compelling. The next skill is called Maintenance Specialist, and this performs the same function and in the same way as preventative maintenance that we have today. So it reduces the chance of modules being incapacitated by 30%. One other thing, actually, I should make a comment here at this point, because I'm touching on some skills that are under the current system buffed by certain unique and historical commanders. There's no statement in any of these skills about how that's going to get worked out. So I'm not going to speculate at this point on what the implications are for the unique and specialized commanders that have buffed skills. So we'll save that for another day. All right. So that's the level 1 skills. And again, here with Maintenance Specialist, since it's performing the same functions as preventative maintenance, my recommendation would be to keep the skill name the same, but maybe Wargaming has a different motivation for renaming. We'll see. All right, the next skill, oops, sorry, I'm jumping ahead, is called Gunner. And this performs the same function as Expert Marksman today. And it's also a level 2 skill. So we've gotten to level 2 skills. But the level of benefit is different. So today, and I'm going to speak specifically for Battleships because this is going to have different implications for the other classes. But specifically for Battleships, by and large, this skill would be a buff across the board. So, well, actually, let me correct that. That's not true. That's not entirely true. So what it will do is it will improve turret traverse speed by 20% across the board. Now, the current Expert Marksman skill improves turret traverse by 7/10 of a degree per second, which are units that the community tends to not grasp as firmly or as easily. The stating that your turret traverse is actually going to improve by 20% is something that I think is more more easily understood by the community. So I kind of like how this is being phrased. However, the implication of this is that for turret traverses, if I've done the math correctly and I'm understanding how Wargaming will compute this, this will be a straight buff for any battleships where their base turret traverse is basically 51 seconds or faster. So if you have something that's 30 seconds or 36 seconds or 45, which are very common numbers, this increase by 20% is actually a buff on top of the current Expert Marksman. For turret traverses that are slower than 51.42 seconds approximately, or slower. So this means things like Yamato and Warspite, etc. This is actually effectively a nerf. So either I've done the math wrong, or Wargaming will need to come up with some sort of explanation about how this will be implemented. But my initial read on this is that for the majority of battleships, this is going to be a buff, and for a small minority of battleships, this will actually effectively be a nerf. It will actually not improve the turret traverse as much as the Expert Marksman does today. All right, so I spent a fair amount of time on that because this is a very commonly taken skill. The next skill is IFHE for battleships. Now it's called Threshing. It's a level 2 skill, and it has exactly the same function that IFHE does today. It improves the penetration of HE shells by 25%, and it cuts the base fire chance in half before modifiers are applied. So, and they also stress here that the fractional value of the new penetration capacity will be rounded down. So the implication here is that for secondary builds where players were maybe hesitant to take IFHE because it was too high of an investment, even if they saw some value potentially, now this becomes a little more of a compelling argument. Again, I think it will vary by ship. So for example, for the Massachusetts, I think it will be a more compelling argument. And maybe for ships like the Friedrich der Große and for the Pommern, it will also be much more viable. But this is something now that is much more, potentially much more compelling. All right, next skill is Consumables Expert, and this increases the action time of some consumables. So specifically Hydroacoustic Search, Surveillance Radar, Smoke Generator, which again, right now I don't know of any battleships that have Smoke Generator, and Engine Boost as well. So this could be a very useful skill to have on ships that have some of these specialized consumables. Okay, the next skill is Priority Target. They've called it Argus Ide, and I think this is in reference to a Greek mythical character called Argus, or at least there's many, but the one that I'm assuming they're associating with this is a creature that had 100 eyes, and so therefore could be looking in multiple directions at the same time. So I think this is what it's named after. Again, Wargaming, I would encourage you to maybe preserve the existing names so that one, it's easier to remember, and two, that people don't have to learn a new name. But basically, this is Priority Target. Also note that it is a level 2 skill, so it's a little more expensive. All right, the next skill is AA Guns Training Expert. And what this will do is this will increase the priority sector reinforcement by 20%, but it does it in a way that is atypical of how other modifiers work. So usually most modifiers in the game that reduce concealment or improve some other, the range of secondary guns and things like that, usually those are compounded. They're based on multiplication. In this case, it's a cumulative or an additive effect. So the example that they give here is that normally when you set your AA priority sector, the reinforced side is the AA is at 135% of normal. What this skill will do is it will increase it from 135 to 155%. So it's not multiplying 135 by 120%. It's simply adding 20 to the number, and therefore you get a 155% increase in the AA on that side. So again, this might be something that's useful for an AA build, and again, I'll get to some potential build options here in a little bit. All right, next skill is Vigilance. This performs exactly the same function as it does today. Interestingly, it's a level 2 skill instead of level 3, and thank you, Wargaming, for keeping the same name. So that, I think that will help. All right, the next skill, or the next set of skills are going to be level 3. So the first one is Armor Piercing, and this one's very interesting, but it has a significant trade-off based on the current proposal. So this skill, if taken, will increase AP shell damage by 5%. Okay, most battleships fire AP most of the time, so that would seem to be very beneficial. However, it comes with a significant trade-off. It will increase the duration of floods and fires on your ship by 40%. And that seems like a very steep penalty to pay to have the improved shell damage. So it's clear that Wargaming doesn't want to make this like a no-brainer choice for battleship players. So of course, you want to increase your AP shell damage. And so I can see that they want to incorporate some sort of trade-off so that you have to make a very conscious choice whether this is the right thing for your build. But a 40% increase in fire and flooding duration feels high, but again, we'll have to see how that works out. And again, I can't overemphasize that all of this is subject to change. All right, the next skill is Secondary Armament Ballistician, and this will increase the secondary battery range by 20%. So this performs the function of IFHE does today to increase secondary battery range, but it's implemented as a level 3 skill. All right, the next skill is Adrenaline Rush, and again, thank you, Wargaming, for keeping the same name. This performs exactly the same function as we have today, but it is now a level 3 skill. I am still thinking that this is going to be a borderline mandatory skill for any surface combatant on their ship build at some point for their captains, depending upon how many skill points they have. Because in my opinion, Adrenaline Rush, when it was introduced back in 060 at the beginning of 2017, excuse me, was arguably the most influential and positive skill in the game that was introduced, that was new to the game, because this concept didn't exist prior to 060. So I think this is still going to be an incredibly useful skill to take. And again, like I said, Wargaming, thank you for keeping the same name. The next skill, I have an issue with the name, is called Survivability Expert, and it is not the same as what we call Survivability Expert today, which increases your HP pool. What this performs the function of is Basics of Survivability. So again, Wargaming, please just call this, or I'm asking you to call this Basics of Survivability so that we don't have to relearn it and we don't get confused by its function. So it reduces the duration of floods and fires by 15%. And again, it's a level 3 skill. So it's identical in all respects other than the name. The next skill is Expert AA Gunner. This will increase this performs a blend of functions between AFT and BFT with regard to AA damage. So BFT increases continuous AA damage by 10%, and AFT today increases the explosion damage from the AA flak burst by 15%. So in this skill, it combines those two effects, although the damage from the explosions, the flak, will be somewhat less. Again, this would be a very suitable skill to take in an AA-centric build. And I'm not going to get into the whole debate about carriers and AA and their value, etc. in this discussion. That's a separate matter. Okay. The next skill is new, and it's kind of interesting. It's called Steady, and it increases torpedo protection by 10%. Now, what Wargaming doesn't say in here is how this will be calculated. So each battleship has, when you look at its survivability parameters in the game, it will tell you what the damage reduction is when a torpedo is taken in the torpedo belt. Right, so the Massachusetts and the Yamato and the Musashi, etc., tend to have the highest damage reduction, and then other battleships tend to have worse. The German battleships in particular have among the worst in the game at around 20-25%. So what Wargaming doesn't say is how the 10% will be increased. Does that mean that if you have a ship with that currently is 25% reduction in damage is now 35%? Or is it 10% of 25%, and therefore the damage reduction is 27.5% instead of 25? Given that this is a level 3 skill, I suspect it's the latter, or the former rather. I suspect that it will increase something where it's like, 25% today to 35%, but there's no note in here to explain, to confirm that. All right, so those are the level 3 skills. The level 4 skills, the first one is very interesting. It's new. It's called Marksman. And what this will do is it will reduce the dispersion of your main battery if there are no visible enemies within your base detection range. Now, one thing I should note here, I'm going to have to jump back up to the top of the spreadsheet to get into some context here. So Wargaming has some notes on the side here. Let me slide over here a little bit. So Wargaming has some notes here that says base concealment is the detectability range by sea based on the parameter section, and it is modified by signals, skills, upgrades, and camouflages. They are not factoring in other aspects like smoke and special talents, local weather, etc. So that's how they're, when they talk about base concealment in these skills, this is how they're determining the base concealment. All right, so let me go back down to this Marksman skill. So what this will mean is that if you have no enemies detected within your base detectability radius, right, then the dispersion of your shells will reduce by 10%. So the way I interpret that means that if there's no enemy that's detected, and again, it doesn't matter who's detecting the ship for you. You could be detecting it yourself. It could be an ally that's detecting for you, whatever. But if there's none within your base detection, and this is, I am assuming, even if you've already fired your guns and your gun bloom is out to your maximum range, if there's no opponents within your base detection range as it normally is calculated, then this benefit takes place. This clearly, if I've understood this correctly, this clearly implies an encouragement of sniping builds, right? Because it means that battleships with, let's say, if they have a base detection range of, let's say, 13 kilometers, so long as there are no detected opponents within their 13-kilometer range, that then they'll get a significant improvement in dispersion of their guns, and therefore ships like the Yamato and the Slava and a lot of the Japanese battleships, etc., will tend to this will potentially be a very useful skill for them based on how they're often played. All right. Now I'm going to get to what to me is potentially the most controversial skill change for battleships based on the current proposal. And I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. This is probably going to require the most time out of all of the items. So they have a skill that is called Secondary Armament Expert. This is the version of the manual secondaries for, manual secondaries, but it's officially called the Manual Fire Control for Secondary Armament skill today, which is a big mouthful. So I'm okay that they're kind of renaming it here just to make it a little more concise. But today, at least for tier 7 and higher battleships, the manual secondary skill reduces dispersion of the secondary guns by 60%. And in the current implementation, or current proposal, I should say, it would only improve dispersion by 35%. So when I first looked at this, I almost had a cow. I was like, this is going to be a deal breaker for a lot of players who love playing their secondary builds. I think the U.S. Navy battleship mains, like for the Massachusetts and the Georgia and Ohio, may be a little less concerned because they get a buffed dispersion on their secondaries out of the box. But certainly the German battleship players and even the French and Japanese that like to play with secondary builds, this would be a big, big deal. But I need to go back to the notes that are at the top of the article because I think there are other factors here that can help explain why wargaming might be going with this change. So it starts with this fourth item. The mechanics of the manual fire control for secondary armament skill were changed. Now, secondary guns fire all the time in all directions. However, the bonus to the accuracy from the skills applied only toward the target designated by the player. So the way that I read this, I'm sorry if I sound rather dramatic because I want to make sure that this point is clear, and I'm trying also to convince myself that I'm understanding this correctly. So a long-standing ask from a lot of secondary build players is that even if they've set a primary secondary target with the manual secondary skill, they would still like to have their secondaries firing on the other side of the ship, and the current proposal would say, okay, yeah, let's do that. Now, if you can imagine that if they allowed secondaries to fire on both sides of the ship, and they preserved the 60% reduction in dispersion for the manual secondary skill, now all of a sudden, these secondary build battleships have an immediate buff. And, maybe some of you secondary build fans out there are like, woohoo, let's, that I'm okay with that. But I think wargaming is probably, my read is that wargaming wants to arrive at a solution where the net effect of secondaries remains essentially neutral. In other words, the total amount of damage and damage production and performance and efficacy of the secondaries remain overall flat with these changes. And if they're going to allow secondaries to fire in all directions and potentially be hitting other targets at the same time, then they need to reduce the performance of the secondaries against the prioritized target so that the overall effect and damage production for the secondaries remains essentially the same. Now, if that's a valid hypothesis, and if if I'm correctly interpreting what wargaming intends to do here with this skill, then I think that's maybe an okay trade-off. Now, maybe 35% isn't the right change. Maybe it should be a 40% reduction, or maybe it should be 30 or something. So clearly this is going to have to get worked out during testing to see what the overall effect is. And it might be that this will be unpopular with the community during testing, and maybe they revamp the skill or whatever. But that this is, I think, the reason that they're going with this approach. So hopefully that explains things relatively well. And like I said, if you just read this one skill alone without any context, it would just appear as just a raw nerf. But I don't think that's Wargaming's intentions here. One other thing regarding secondaries that Wargaming cited as the fifth point here that I thought was interesting. So they say that furthermore, we are planning to increase the base secondary armament firing range for the majority of battleships, and detailed information will be announced at a later date. So there's nothing in here about what that means. Does that mean that battleships that have relatively poor secondary ranges today will get buffed, and existing battleships that have very good ranges or the highest ranges will remain the same? Will they increase them across the board? Are they only going after particular tiers? We don't know. So stay tuned. But it feels like Wargaming is going to try to encourage more secondary level engagements by the community overall, and not isolate it too much to a very select set of ships like we have today. All right, that actually is a great segue to this next skill, which is new, and I also think is incredibly interesting. It's called Straight A Artillerist, and what it does is two things. It improves the reload on secondary armaments by 10%. So that's the effect that BFT has today on secondary armament, is that it reduces the reload. But it will also reduce the reload of main battery guns when enemies are detected within your secondary battery range. So if I've understood this correctly, a secondary build ship, like for the Germans and Massachusetts and Georgia and Ohio, etc., or even the French and Japanese battleship players, if they like to play them this way, has the potential to turn those ships into even bigger monsters than they are right now, because it improves not only the DPM of their secondaries, but their main battery as well. So this would clearly be a very useful skill certainly for play modes like the clan brawls and the 3-on-3 modes that we saw with Rank Sprint earlier this month or back in August. So this would be an incredibly useful skill from that perspective. How effective this skill would be in randoms, where there tends to be a lot more standoff play, I don't know, but it is a very interesting skill. So one that I'm looking forward to and trying out. All right, the next skill is Emergency Repair Expert. And this combines a couple of effects. So first of all, it increases the action time of both damage control party and repair party consumables. So it has some of the same effects as some of the ship consumable upgrade that we could put in slot 5 now. It also gives you one additional consumable charge of damage control party and repair party. So just as a reminder, most of the Russian and Soviet battleships have a limited number of damage control party charges, so it would affect them. Other ships, obviously, that have an unlimited damage control are unaffected. But it gives you the one extra charge of the repair party consumable. So this acts as sort of a combination of things, including Superintendent, specifically for the repair party consumable, which is very commonly taken. Again, I want to stress here, this is a level 4 skill, so it's a significant investment. All right, next two skills are identical to what we have today. Concealment Expert reduces detection of a ship by 10%, and Fire Prevention reduces the decreases the maximum number of fires to 3 and reduces the chance of being set on fire. So those two skills remain the same. And again, thank you, Wargaming, for keeping the names of these skills essentially the same. All right, so those are the skills. And let me jump over to one other thing that I worked on while I was going through this. So I did some brainstorming around what I think build structures might look like under the current proposal. Again, all of this is subject to change, and this might be a complete waste of time if it turns out Wargaming completely nukes eliminates the entire plan altogether, which I don't think they will do. But if they significantly change the skill structure, all of this could be moot. So just take this as, just, sort of wishful thinking or brainstorming, if nothing else. All right. So the first thing I'm going to touch on is I think there are a body of skills that I think most players would want to take on a lot of builds or most builds. So Gunner, which is the equivalent of Expert Marksman, is very popular on a number of battleships. It's less needed on others. So for example, the Massachusetts, the Roma, the Bismarck, the Gneisenau, certainly the Scharnhorst, they either don't need, or it's not particularly pressing that they take Expert Marksman, and so that skill could be dropped. Argus Ide, which is again the current priority target, not all battleship players take. I take it because I like the information that it gives me. So, but this I expect will be something a lot of players would take. Adrenaline Rush, I've sort of sarcastically said, why are you bothering to ask? To me, this is a no-brainer. I feel free to challenge my opinion on this, but Adrenaline Rush to me should be the basis of any surface combat ship build at some point for Commander. All right, last one is the emergency repair expert, because this is the one that gives you the extra charge on the repair party consumable. Now, keep in mind that not necessarily all of these would be taken. The only one for sure that I definitely would take pretty much on any battleship build would be Adrenaline Rush. The other ones are maybe more situational, depending upon what you want to get out of your ship and the game mode that you're in, etc. But keep in mind that taking all of these is going to limit flexibility in some of the other aspects of the build. All right, so if you were to go with a survivability centric build, the skills involved here would be the emergency repair specialist, that acts as sort of the jack of all trades for repair party and damage control to reduce their cooldown. Maintenance specialist acts as the preventative maintenance element. Survivability expert is, again, what we call basics of survivability. I do know a number of battleship players that don't take this skill because they see it as providing diminishing returns on upgrades and signals and things like that. And to them, that skill is less compelling. And then the last two skills, concealment and fire prevention, are core even today to survivability builds. So I think these are kind of no-brainers in that type of build. So again, I want to point out here that if you were to take all of these skills, you're not going to be able to take all of these skills. And again, just as a reminder, in case people haven't seen the article, the number of skill points for commanders is being increased to 21 as the maximum. So even with that, taking all of these skills, so these 5 and these 4 all together in one go, is not possible. So you would end up having to make some trade-offs. The next build would be a secondary build to look at. Threshing, which is the equivalent of IFHE, again, could be optional, depends upon the ship. Since the secondary performance or the dispersion benefit is going to be the same, would be the same across all tiers. So today, the manual secondary skill doesn't improve dispersion much on the tier 6 and lower ships, but under the current proposal, it would have the same benefit as for the upper tiers. There's a more compelling argument to take secondary builds for lower tier battleships. But those lower tier battleships, especially the Germans, already get buff penetration, and I would think that Threshing, for example, on a Bayern or a König would probably be completely optional or useless. Frankly, it would be a waste of points because they already have buff penetration, and they would see very few, if any, ships that they would play against where their base penetration would not exceed what they need. But for other ships like the Massachusetts and the Bismarck, Tirpitz, Friedrich, the Pommern, etc., this could definitely be useful. The secondary armament ballistician, which increases secondary battery range. Again, this would be kind of a no-brainer since this is what is covered by IFHE today. The secondary armament expert, which acts as the manual fire control for secondary armament. Again, this is kind of a no-brainer for a secondary build. And then the next skill to me is very compelling in modes where you're clearly going to be in brawling situations routinely. the straight 8 artillerist is clearly highly valued. For random battles, I can argue that maybe there's a less compelling. It's a pretty high investment for, you know, questionable value. You know, you're going to have some games which are where it's incredibly useful, and then you're going to have other games where it's a complete waste because you can't viably get into secondary ranges and bring this to bear. So it will depend. All right, the last build to mention here, and again, laugh all you want. I think it is worth mentioning AA builds since some people do still do them on some battleships, like for the U.S. Navy battleships. AA Gunner to me isn't very valuable because it only adds an extra flak explosion or burst. So I'm not sure how much value that is. The Gunner's Training Expert to increase the priority reinforcement to me is actually could be quite effective. So that would be quite useful. And then the Expert AA Gunner, which increases damage from both the continuous and the flak bursts. Absolutely, this would be very useful on a ship build, and even might be incorporated into a survivability build if you're willing to trade off some of these other things like what is now going to be called survivability expert. So this skill, the Expert AA Gunner, strikes me as potentially quite useful. All right, so let me get to some skills that are being dropped, or at least partially dropped. So Direction Center, which adds planes to your fighter squadrons for ships that carry the fighter consumable, is getting dropped. It doesn't exist for battleships. And again, each class has its own set of skills. And so some skills that are being dropped here for battleships can exist for other classes. And vice versa. So this is specific to battleships. This might be an issue for some players who like taking the fighter consumable and want the extra AA that Direction Center provides. But I'm guessing Wargaming dropped this because they don't see enough players using it, or it doesn't synchronize with the other content that they've got here. Incoming fire alert is also being dropped for battleships. Again, this might be an issue for some players. I do know some battleship players that have this skill in lieu of like priority target, so that when they're getting shot at from long range, they know that these shots are coming in. So this potentially might be an issue. Again, incoming fire alert does exist, or under a different name, for other classes, and so it's specific to battleships that this is being dropped, or would be dropped. Next is Superintendent. So today we have a Superintendent skill that adds a consumable charge across all consumables. This is being dropped in its sort of pure form. It does exist for cruisers. I haven't double checked for destroyers yet. But the replacement, there's a partial replacement, which is the Emergency Repair Expert, which gives you the extra charge on the repair party consumable and the damage control. But for other consumables like hydro, radar, reload boosters, etc., this will no longer exist, or under the proposal, it would no longer exist. Survivability Expert under the current name, which increases the HP pool on battleships, is getting dropped. I'm going to assume that from the majority of players, this is kind of, not, this doesn't require much explanation why dropping it is perfectly fine. Massive AA Fire is also getting dropped. In fact, I think it's getting dropped across the board. I think Wargaming recognizes this ended up being kind of a dud skill as a replacement for the manual AA skill that we had before the rework. So again, this is something that's not too surprising. There will be no radio location skill for battleships. Now, it will exist for other classes, but it won't exist for battleships, and this might be a potential loss for some competitive builds. I do know that there have been some clans in the past when they're playing clan battles and stuff, put radio location on most, if not all, of their ships, even battleships, so they can triangulate the position of opponents that are undetected. And so this might be an issue for some players. Last Stand is not going to exist for battleships. There's a quasi replacement for Last Stand for other classes, which I'll get to in other videos. But again, this is not a very commonly taken skill for battleships anyway, so I don't think Last Stand is too much of an issue. And then lastly, 2 torpedo-centric builds, or skills I should say, don't exist for battleships. So Torpedo Armament Expert, which reduces or improves the reload on torpedoes and torpedo acceleration, which improves the torpedo speeds. Neither of those are going to be available. So sorry, Gneisenau, Tirpitz, and Scharnhorst players who took these. You're just going to have to work without these. And frankly, I would have never have taken this on a battleship anyway. So in any case, most of these drop skills, at least per the current proposal, aren't too much of an issue. I think the ones that are probably the biggest issue in my mind would be the superintendent skill, because other consumables like reload booster and hydro and radar and stuff, it is valuable to have the extra charge. Maybe Wargaming will compensate that by just intrinsically increasing the number of charges these ships get out of the box without them having to take superintendent. But again, there's nothing in the article to say that might be true. But to me, out of all of the ones that are listed here, this is the one that's probably the most controversial that's being dropped. All right, so I think that's going to pretty well wrap it up. I realized this was a long video. In fact, I'm 40 minutes in, which is way longer than I wanted to do, but I thought there was some really interesting information here. I'm going to do this for other classes as well. If you guys look at this and say, man, this is way too freaking long, please let me know, and I'll try to condense these down. And I will leave an index in the video description. Although at this point, by the time you've gotten to this part of the video, you've either gotten here already or you haven't seen the index and don't care. So in any case, I think that's going to wrap it up. Thanks much if you made it this far for watching. We hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.